So next, let's talk about Flex Wrap. And here we're going to come up with a design similar to this. Let's talk about how we're getting this to work and what different properties we can end up using here. So what I'm going to do, let me get rid of my code that's here. Let's do this from scratch. So if we do this, let's start by dealing with any div that's located below another div. And we'll say border solid 1 pixel black. So we've got all these divs that are here. We've got some classes on some other ones that we'll use shortly. But if we did this, we would just have a bunch of divs that were stacked on top of each other. So let's first of all give each of these a little bit of a height, 100 pixels. All right. Then we've got these divs that are stacked on top of each other. So first thing we're going to end up doing is, let's say that we wanted to take this parent div and we display in Flex. So now we've got all these divs and they're going to end up stacking up right next to each other. Now, again, we could give each of these a width as well. And they'll end up stacking right here next to each other. But one of the problems that we have here is that even though we've specified a width, they're not going to move from line to line. They're just going to be displayed on this one horizontal axis. So one of the things that commonly you want to end up doing is you want to have some width, but you want things to flow to the next line of the Flex box. And this is where we end up coming up with something called Flex Wrap. That's the property that we're going to look at. And again, this is something that's on the parent container. So by default, there is no wrap, and here we'll say Flex Wrap is equal to wrap. In which case, we'll start to see the items end up going down to the next line. Let's look at a couple of other things that end up coming up. Let's say for the sake of argument, one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to have each of these items occupy 33% or 1/3. We wanted basically 3 items per line. What we could end up doing here is if we went over here, we could say our width, and we could do something like 33%. But one of the things that we could also do is we could specify, hey, look, not exactly, let's actually get the full number. And what we'll do is we're going to say we're going to calculate. And here you could end up doing calculations, and we'll say we want to do 100%, but we want to divide it by 3. So it's going to be 33.33. And we're left with a little bit of a surprise. The surprise that we have is that we don't have 3 items on one line. And this has to do with something called box sizing, which doesn't count the border. And the problem is that we do have this 1 pixel border, and we could get all these things on one line by saying, and this is really, some would even argue this should be the default setting. We could say the box sizing, we want you to include the border, so we could say border box. Now if we do that, everything stays on one line. But what if we also went over here and we said, hey, look, we also want to have some margin between these guys, and we're going to say we want to have a margin of, again, the size of a font, which is, again, about 16 pixels. And now, again, we end up going on multiple lines because the margin really is not included in this. But one of the things we could do is that we could give a calculation here. And we could say, hey, look, since there's going to be a margin on either side of you, which is going to be 1 REM, we could subtract the 2 REM. And now, at this point, we'll end up showing up on one line, and each of these will take up a third. Now, we could deal with making things responsive later on, but this is one way where we could have things wrap over to different rows. Now, what about a scenario where we'll go over here, and this is 100 pixel. Let's use our long property here. And we'll say that, hey, look, if you're long, we'll say that your height, and we'll end up making your height 150 pixels. So now these are going down to the next line. They're not all even. Now we can actually talk about doing a couple of different things. We really have no alignment to worry about on our main axis. And one thing to realize is that we've actually got 3 main axes here, because these end up going over to the next line, and we've really set the widths on each of these axes where these are wrapping over to. So one of the things we could end up looking at, and this is where we've ended up looking at justify content and align items. So when we talk about align items, let's actually switch this up a little bit. And let's say align items is going to be, let's give a couple of values here. So we've got our flexbox, not item, but items. Okay? So this is kind of an interesting thing. What this tells us is the same as it was before, is that when we talk about align items and we talk about the vertical axis, this is the vertical axis per row, which is what it was before we had things wrapping to the next line. So if we do align items center, for each of those flex rows, the items within that row are going to end up aligning to the center. We could do, I think we might have done this already, flex start. They're aligning on the top of each row, flex end. So if you had all the same size items, you would never see the difference here. But this is within a particular row. So this is within a particular row. What about the whole grouping of items? Well, that's where align content comes in. And if I just went over here and I said align content flex start, and I did this, we'd see no change because that's actually what the default is. But if I go over here and I say align content, let's make sure this is actually correct. And one of the reasons why we're still not seeing a difference is that this div itself is only taking up as much room as it needs to take up. So in order to sort of see this, let's go over here and say the height of this outer container. We'll make it a little bit bigger. We'll say it's going to be 100 of the view height. And now we could see that since our container is the whole view height, now the whole group of these is going to the end, right? And let's just make a little bit of difference here. Align items, let's say, is center. So within a row, they're going to be centered, but the block of them is going to go down to the bottom, flex end. I could also go over here, and I could say align content, flex start. Now it's going to line up at the top, but again, the individual rows here that are wrapped are going to be in the center. And I could also go over here and I could say, how about space between? So they'll fill up the entire area and give me the same space between. Or I could say space around, which will, again, what it's really doing is it's taking these, each row of items and treating them as an individual item, and it's giving me some margin between these 2 items. So it can be a little bit tricky, but this is one of the ways that you'll end up using flex wrap. And let's just throw one other quick thing here. Obviously, when this gets much smaller, we might want to change this. And this is where we can end up using media queries. So a real simple thing to do here is to go over here and say, hey, look, media query. We're going to make a media query, and we're going to say, hey, look, this is going to work, but for the max width, and we'll say, once you get up to 600 pixels, we want this to be in effect. So up to 600 pixels, and we'll say, hey, look, if you're a div underneath a div, we're going to make your width, and we'll simply say you're going to take up 100% of your available area, as opposed to the 33% over here. And now what will happen is that as we go smaller here, right, this is something that'll look a little bit better on a smaller screen. As we go above 600 pixels, so below, we've just got 1 item per row, and above, we've got 3. So all kinds of things you could do to make things more responsive, to use flex wrap, and to do some calculations as well.